In the Bible, there are dark stories of sexual sins that are so terrible that it might be better for you not to watch this video, such as the night when the inhabitants of a city attempted to gang rape two angels sent by God, or the case where two daughters, driven by desperation, decided to do the unthinkable, get their own father drunk to become pregnant by him, or the most disturbing story of all in the Bible, where men of the city did unimaginable things to a woman all night long, brutalizing her to death. And what her beloved did afterward for revenge is even more horrendous. These are the 7 darkest stories about sexual sins and their devastating consequences, accounts that show how lust and immorality not only destroyed individuals, but also entire families, cities, and even nations like Sodom, a place where God's laws were not only ignored, they were ridiculed. The city of Sodom lived immersed in a culture of excesses and immorality, where personal pleasure prevailed over moral principles. The population indulged in perverse and violent sexual practices, and even children grew up in this degrading environment. Lot, who tried to remain righteous, faced the difficult task of protecting his family amid this decadence. The city not only glorified sexual sin, but was also marked by selfishness, arrogance, and cruelty, with the rich ignoring the needy. The sin of Sodom was so severe that God decided to destroy the city, after Abraham interceded for it, but not even 10 righteous people were found. The destruction was carried out with fire and brimstone, and even Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt for disobeying the command not to look back. This story serves as a reminder of God's judgment on extreme immorality and corruption. Sure, here is a translation, and we will see it next. It was a quiet night in Gibeah, a city that was part of the inheritance of the tribe of Benjamin. But what seemed to be just another day of common life quickly turned into a landmark of horror and tragedy that would be remembered for generations. A Levite, a man responsible for serving God, was on a journey with his concubine. Long journeys were dangerous at that time, especially at night, as bandits and violent men lurked in the shadows. As night fell, the Levite and his concubine arrived in Gibeah, believing that since it was a city of Israelites, they would find hospitality and safety. However, they soon realized that Gibeah was a very different place from what they expected. The Levite and his concubine sat in the main square, waiting for someone to invite them to stay the night, as was the custom among the people of Israel. But no one appeared, no one welcomed them. It was an unusual behavior, as hospitality was a hallmark of God's people. However, in Gibeah, the hearts of the people were hardened. They ignored the needs of the traveler, which already showed the moral decay of that community. Finally, an old man, also a foreigner, saw the Levite and his concubine in the square. He knew something was wrong and, approaching, said, "Come to my house. Do not stay here in the square tonight." There was a tone of urgency in his voice, as if he wanted to protect them from something terrible. The Levite accepted the invitation, and they followed the old man to his house, thinking they would be safe. But the night was just beginning. While the Levite, his concubine, and the host were inside the house, sounds began to echo from outside. Initially, footsteps, then whispers, which soon turned into shouts and violent banging on the door. Men from all parts of Gibeah, young and old, surrounded the house. They were seeking something terrible. "Bring out the man who is staying there. We want to sleep with him," they shouted. It was an abominable request, a demonstration of the total depravity of that city. The crowd was not only driven by lust, but it was also an expression of violence and power, an attempt to judge and humiliate the old man. Horrified, the old man went out to try to appease the crowd. "Please, my brothers, do not commit this wickedness." The episode occurred when Israel camped at Shittim in the wilderness after their journey from Egypt. Instead of remaining faithful to God and His laws, many Israelites began to engage with Moabite women. These women not only seduced them sexually, but also led them to worship their pagan gods, provoking God's wrath. This mixture of sexual immorality and idolatry was one of the gravest sins committed by the people of Israel, as it involved a direct violation of God's commandments. When God saw the transgression, He sent a devastating plague to the people of Israel. Thousands of people died as a result of this plague. It was a severe but just punishment for their disobedience. However, one man, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, did something remarkable to prevent total destruction. When an Israelite dared to bring a Midianite woman into the camp, further defying God's order, Phinehas, filled with zeal for God's holiness, took a spear and killed the man and the woman on the spot. His courage and immediate action prevented God's wrath from further descending upon the people, and the plague was stopped. God, impressed by Phinehas' attitude, made a promise to him that his priestly lineage would remain forever. This episode is a grim reminder of how sexual immorality and idolatry, when accepted or tolerated, can bring devastating consequences. Even though God showed mercy by stopping the plague, the gravity of the sin was evident and was not taken lightly. This type of transgression, not only physical but also spiritual, shows how serious God's laws are, and that disobeying them not only affects the individual but an entire nation. The stories of moral and spiritual corruption described in the Bible are not just historical accounts, but warnings to maintain purity and obedience to divine commandments. They reveal how sin, especially sexual sin and idolatry, can corrupt a community, a city, an entire nation, and lead to consequences that affect generations. When the leaders of the tribes received the pieces of the body, they were horrified. It was a call for justice, a plea for all Israel to rise against the sin that had corrupted Gibeah. All of Israel gathered at Mizpah to decide what to do. The tribes demanded that the men of Gibeah be handed over to be judged and punished, but the tribe of Benjamin refused. Instead, they decided to protect the guilty, even knowing the abominable act they had committed. This refusal led to a devastating civil war. The tribes of Israel turned against Benjamin, and the battle was bloody. In the end, almost the entire tribe was exterminated. Only 600 men survived, hidden in the mountains. The story of Gibeah ended in destruction and mourning, but sexual sins did not stop there. What happens when two desperate daughters decide to get their father drunk, to commit the most absurd act ever recorded in the Bible? After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughter's world had changed forever. They narrowly escaped divine wrath, but everything they knew was lost. The sound of burning cities and the smell of sulfur were still present. As Lot fled to the mountains, following the instructions of the angels, now hidden in a cave, they were isolated, without community, without a visible future, and with a cloud of despair hanging over their heads. Lot, who once prospered on the plains of Sodom, now lived as a refugee, not knowing what would come next. Lot's daughters, raised in Sodom, not only lost their home but also their vision of what was right and wrong. To them, the future seemed impossible. They thought there were no more men in the world, and that their lineage would end there in oblivion. The eldest daughter, driven by despair, said to the youngest, "Our father is old, and there are no men around to marry us, as is the custom throughout the land." Lot's daughters, worried about the lack of descendants after the destruction of Sodom, intoxicated him and lay with him without his noticing. Both became pregnant and gave rise to two nations hostile to Israel, the Moabites and the Ammonites. This act of incest, despite being an attempt to preserve the lineage, had devastating consequences, with these peoples opposing Israel throughout history. Meanwhile, Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, priests of Israel, became corrupt and immoral, disregarding God's laws and abusing their position. They stole from the sacred offerings and forced women serving at the tabernacle to submit to their desires. Eli, despite knowing about the abuses, did not act decisively. This led to divine judgment. God cut off Eli's lineage and announced the death of his sons. They died in battle against the Philistines, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured, marking the end of an era of corruption in the priesthood of Israel. Sure, here's the translation of the passage. The people of Israel were camped on the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, about to enter the promised land. Despite the many blessings and miracles of God, Israel fell into sin, becoming involved with the women of Moab and practicing idolatry. Balak, the king of Moab, tried to weaken Israel through Balaam, but when he was unsuccessful, he used the Moabite women to seduce the Israelites and lure them into worshiping Baal Peor, involving rituals of sexual immorality. Many Israelites succumbed to the temptation, disobeying God, which provoked divine wrath. As a consequence, a deadly plague began to spread through the camp, killing thousands. The zealous act of the priest Phinehas, who killed an Israelite and a Midianite woman in Flagranti, stopped the plague and brought the promise of an everlasting covenant with God. In total, 24,000 people died. The story also narrates the tragedy between Amnon, son of David, and his sister Tamar. Amnon, driven by lust, planned an act of violence against Tamar with the help of his cousin Jonadab. After raping her, Amnon despised her and expelled her. This episode brought pain and destruction to David's family. Tamar, after being raped by Amnon, was expelled, humiliated, and shamed. She sought refuge in the house of her brother Absalom, who took her in and vowed revenge. King David learned of the incident and was furious, but took no action against Amnon, perhaps due to his position or guilt for past sins. Absalom, waiting 2 years, organized a feast and ordered the killing of Amnon, avenging his sister. This act of sexual violence destroyed David's family, causing pain and division. Tamar never recovered. Amnon lost his life, and Absalom entered into conflict with David, starting a rebellion that almost destroyed the kingdom. The story illustrates how sexual sin can have devastating consequences and spread, affecting everyone around. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. Leave your like and share with your friends so that more people can learn from these powerful stories. Comment below what you thought and tell us what else you would like to see here. Until the next video, and remember, every choice has its consequences. May we learn from the mistakes of others and strive to live wisely and with integrity.